Welcome back to Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, chapters 34 to 38. And of course, this is Conversations at the Leaky Cauldron. I'm sorry, I was reading from my notes there. Back with me are my astute colleagues, Miss Sarah Miller and Mr. Wesley Schantz. Welcome back, you two.
Great to be here.
Greetings. Cheers.
Greetings. Cheers. And so I suppose the best way to start a podcast is in the same way that it's best to start a seminar, with a question or with a mystery that we set out to be solved. And in the pre-show, Sarah, you had sort of brought up one of the earlier chapters that we read, the Department of Mysteries, and what the concept of a myth, and you had asked what the concept of mystery even means to magical folk who seem to themselves be a mystery to muggles. And so I thought we might talk a little bit about the prophecies that we found there, about what is studied in the Department of Mysteries, and really just giving some thought to that question of what are the mysteries of the magical world. Did you want to lead with that, Sarah, or we can always defer to Wes?
I mean, deferring to Wes is almost always better. But I'm really interested, I think, in the various rooms that they find, and like and how they are affected by those rooms. I think there's a Death Eater that's affected by one of the things that's housed in one of the rooms. There seem to be like a dozen rooms, one of which is prophecies, one of which seems to be death, like with the veil, one of which seems to be knowledge or wisdom, one of which seems to be time. I think we're told that there's something in the Department of Mysteries that studies love. I think, I don't know, it's kind of cool to think that there's one place where all of these mysteries are explored. And I think it's also kind of cool that those are mysteries like in our world, right? It doesn't mean you can't study them and learn things about them, right? But like the mind, time, love, death, this magical world is equally perplexed by some like kind of universal human realities or constructs or experiences. And I think that's kind of cool. I think we were saying in the pre-show that, there's some pretty heavy shit in these final few paragraphs or final few chapters that I don't know. That's sort of what I was intrigued by, is that there's a place where there's almost like the essence of these mysteries, and there are the unspeakables who work down there and who study them all day. I think that's kind of cool.
Yeah, I think the minds as being like literally brains in a vat is actually, maybe all of them are actually also a little kind of funny. Like there's something humorous about each of the mysteries, to me at least. Part of that is, taking the idea, like this kind of philosophical thought experiment about the brain in a vat, and then like making it a literal thing there, and then having them start to attack you. Ron goes a little funny in the head at some point, so there's like this contagious element to the laughter that's sort of like bubbling under the surface there. There's also like Bellatrix, her weird attitude towards everything, and it even seems to affect Sirius, where in his last moments, like what he's saying is a taunt or something like that. And so there's just something interesting about the tone of these chapters. I think it is heavy, but it's almost trying to kind of like stave off melodrama through elements of humor, which I think are pretty interesting and actually kind of successful. Just starting from like the rescue mission that they get as their name badges when they start going in.
Yeah, could you comment a little bit more about because I had never thought about it in this way, the concepts that are explored through their embodiments in the room. So you said there were the brains, which actually had literal tendrils, and we hear later from Madame Pomfrey that thoughts can hurt you. And that's for sure. As I was teaching in Dante today, I was essentially teaching that the truth The problem with truth is that it can dispel harmony, and that was part of the message of Adam leaving the Garden of Eden, according to Dante in Canto 26 of the Paradiso, that when you go beyond your normal bounds, you disrupt the harmony of your current life, but you do learn something that you long for, perhaps even more than harmony, but that is the cost. And so I think
that's awesome.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, that's exactly what we talked about in my class today on our seminar on All My Sons. So
that's incredible.
Great, great minds think alike.
Well, you're giving me higher praise than I deserve, but kingly praise, Miss Sarah Miller. Thank you. And I'm glad that y'all's kids are getting the same thing. And I'm glad to have that correspondence too, because, sometimes I say these things and I have no idea whether anybody in the world will agree with them. And so that's great. But so the brains in the vat, we're studying the mind, you say. And then of course we have the time chamber where the Death Eaters continues to turn from a baby into a person. Like there's a repetitive element in it, sort of a hellish Sisyphean element. The time turners then keep falling and then going back together, sort of like the story of the Old Testament and like sort of the rises and falls there, or whatever metaphor you choose. And so what were the other ones, Wes and Sarah? And what did their specific embodiments mean to you? Because that's very much piquing my interest as well.
Well, I like what you said, Wes, about like the kind of funny way in which some of it's delivered. Like you're right that like the way they get in and like the strange automated voice that's treating them and this entire experience like it's just another visitor is funny. And I absolutely like Ron is funny, and the Death Eater kind of becoming a baby is funny. But I think there's one that to me stands out as not funny. And it's not, it's quite grave, but it's also, it's not complex, right? It's just that stone amphitheater where there's like a veil at the bottom, an archway that Harry is really attracted to. And Luna hears voices behind it just as much as Harry does, which is, kind of a clue that there's something that the two of them share, just like the two of them can see the Thestrals. And it's because of what they've experienced in their lives and who they've lost and how they've been so close to loss that they're sort of like oddly attracted to it, which again, when Harry is being like possessed by Voldemort and he says he just wants to die, but like death has got to be no worse than the pain that he's feeling. And it's funny, like his willingness to die, his attraction to it in some ways is a power rather than like being afraid of it. And it's something he doesn't quite totally understand. And it's the archway where there's the final battle. It's my least favorite thing about the movie is because I think that the scene where the kids find the space before the battle takes place in there is so important. And I just, that's to me is like the one mystery that isn't kind of dealt with in a way that's a little hokey. I mean, maybe it is a little hokey. I don't know, but it seems really stripped of silliness. And this idea that like the mystery of death is that it's really just this really fine but defined liminal moment, right? Where, you were a 0 and now you're a 1. You were alive and now you're dead. Like there's very little space in between those two realities, and yet it's absolutely untraveled distance, right? It's the undiscovered country. It's like you can't get there, right? It's I don't know. I think that it's a really effective image for something that for the vast majority of the population reading this book, it's not going to be something that they've had to or want to think about. But what a highly effective way of getting people to think about what is death and what does it feel like and what does it mean for you and what happens after death. And like, man, 16 is when you start to ask those questions, and hopefully not sooner, because those are really hard questions. I mean, they nearly drive Hamlet insane. And I think that to me is not silly. It didn't ring silly to me, at least.
Yeah, and his disbelief at 3 different moments, the first of which being at that gate, Harry's disbelief at Sirius's death, and then his disbelief that the gift of Sirius that we talked about last time but couldn't define because Harry didn't know about it yet, is this sort of Beauty and the Beast-esque mirror that shows you the holder of the other mirror. And of course, this plays in again to that interesting James and Sirius, Harry and Sirius dynamic, this brother-father dynamic that Dumbledore outlined so intelligently as Voldemort exploiting in the final chapters. And I also want to talk a little bit about Harry's failures and dragging his friends into danger, but also their willingness to do that. And that those are their choices and what they trained for. But I agree with you, Sarah, that it is the student, Hermione and Ron are very much disturbed when they all first enter there. And, Harry's like, do you hear them? Do you hear them? And Ron, is that you? And Ron says, I'm here, mate. And I really love Ron in that moment. I can see why his Patronus is a dog.
Me too.
And
Me too.
He's so loyal. I'm here, mate. He's there. He's solid. And, also just to think about it, it's like Harry should think about the fact that in his world, his Sirius is still alive. And that's Ron. Even though Ron's obviously clumsy and not the, most handsome and gifted wizard in the world, he's pretty up there at this point as a prefect and also a Quidditch champion. And now the eldest Weasley at his school. And Hermione's like, there's nothing there, Harry. There's nothing there. Again, having trouble with that sort of ineffable element of the wizarding world, but also just how Sirius dies into it. How he just disappears behind it, and Harry has that disbelief that, he's going to fall out the other side. He'll see him again. And then, no, he's denied that. And he's denied that 3 times, the same way Peter denied Christ 3 times, but very different effects. But it's so real, that disbelief he has, and how even though he's seen death before and it calls to him out from that terrifying specter of it, even scarier, I would say, than Odysseus or Homer's conception of the Gate of Horn. It's very Tartarian. It's very, disturbingly minimalist, I would say. Sort of like death is minimal in a way, or a minimizing, like you said, a reduction of 1 to 0. You're off the map and forever, as Achilles would agree with in the Odyssey as well. That's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to mention before kicking it over to Wes. It's just that I feel like that disbelief in the wake of yet another thing he loves being taken away from him, and that pattern being developed in Harry's mind now of things he loves getting killed and taken from him because of Voldemort is, I totally resonate with the rage that he throws even at, the guy who's his true godfather now, Albus Dumbledore, and he rages at him because he's so close to him, and that when he doesn't want to be around people, but he does long to be around them, and he can't share how he feels with them. Really, he doesn't want to talk about it. That struggle with death is what really resonated with me.
Yeah, I think that's, it's not super funny in the death chamber. That's fair. But I think that the whole chase scene that ensues after that does kind of have a certain element of slapstick to it. And I think maybe in contrast, that's why that death chamber has to be so somber, is because when we're back in there, that is sort of the climactic part of that struggle, right? Harry's about to give the prophecy back over, the order shows up, and suddenly it's a fair fight again. And then you have of course, Sirius's fall through the veil. I also think it forms a really interesting juxtaposition with the door which doesn't open, right? Which is never open, Dumbledore says. And so they see that right after the veil. It's sort of in terms of what it looks like, it's the opposite, right? It's a door which is sealed, whereas the veil is you can easily walk through. You can hear on the other side that there's people whispering, and the door. Yeah, so I think there's something kind of curious going on there, which wouldn't be as powerful if you didn't come to the door, which doesn't open immediately after having seen the arch and the veil in the other room. So I think that the way that Hermione also sort of like causes lots of doors to be like the door that doesn't open is kind of cool, right? She has this spell that marks doors, so they know which ones not to go through, which is like the arch. And of course, like the cross is pretty interesting to use as a mark.
Yeah.
A fiery cross, right? And then she also does a thing that seals doors shut. And apparently, like, just seeing her do that a few times, everyone else learns how to do it. Or maybe Luna knows that spell too. Anyway, she's going around sealing doors, and so that's kind of cool. Like, they're making more love be in the world in a sense, right? By sealing off doors and protecting one another, and that's all very good. And but also kind of, well, I mean, again, like slapstick is kind of the word I would use for a lot of the battle scenes, like Neville's feet doing a crazy dance, like this sort of, and just the sort of MacGuffin of having the prophecy be this very fragile object, which, so for that reason, Harry is again sort of like protected, in the same sense that he was the boy who lived. Now he's the boy who can't be hit with anything too powerful because you don't want to break the prophecy, because that's the whole point of being there. It's like, it's just very silly. Like, I can't help it. But yeah, that doesn't undercut too much. Or I think on the contrary, it sort of makes the death of Sirius that much more like sudden, powerful, and real, because that is kind of how, like, we're going about our mundane lives. Everything's sort of silly and lighthearted, and then suddenly, someone you care about dies. Well, that just like, that hits you that much harder because you can't not think about it then. Like, you spend a lot of time doing a lot of things to not have to think about serious, weighty, ultimate concerns, and then something will happen where when you least expect it, that person's gone. So then you have to kind of slow down, and time slows down. The way she writes that scene is pretty cool. Like, he falls gracefully. It's very artful, and then immediately after that, you get like the other set piece fight, which is pretty rad. So, but yeah, you guys have more thoughts about that? Or I do want to talk about Dumbledore a bit too here.
Yeah, well, I would like to talk about the Deus Ex Machina of Dumbledore and that fight between him and Voldemort. And, well, Sarah, could you start us off with that? Maybe some of the spells they use, or just his appearance itself and what it symbolizes, and how that ties to the Order of the Phoenix, or what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, well, I think Dumbledore is his appearance, and then obviously the appearance of Fawkes, the Phoenix, I think just are sort of like a signal. You know what? They remind me of a couple moments in The Return of the King and in The Lord of the Rings, where and maybe the parallel is wrong. Maybe what I should be thinking of is the arrival of Gandalf at Helm's Deep, in like book 3 of The Two Towers. The movie version of this scene is gorgeous, but it's totally textually inaccurate. But just the idea that, like, with the savior comes light, right? And like, people recognize, like, the good people see him. Like, Neville is the one to recognize him. I think that's to me really significant in a Christological way. Like, if you read the story through this lens that, like, these characters have analogs or parallel representations in the Christ story, like, that Neville is the one to recognize the arrival of Dumbledore is really significant, especially considering that he could have been the chosen one but wasn't picked for some reason. I think that's worth exploring. But at this point in the story, it's just Neville and Harry, right? Like, Hermione's down for the count, Ron is down for the count. I'm not really sure where Luna and Ginny are and why they're not there, but it's just it's like the two kids whose parents gave everything physically and or mentally, to the order, who, who are there in this like chamber of death, coming. And I think that the symbolism of that is really remarkable. I'm not really sure that I have much to say about all of the spells that Dumbledore used, but I think it's remarkable that Neville is the one, and to the point of the kind of silliness of it all, the levity, shall we say. Like, he can't even really say his name. I think his nose is broken or something. So it's a little bit silly, cinematically light, I guess. But his arrival seems just sort of out of the clear blue sky, but it is the thing that like turns the tides. It's like the eucatastrophe. Like there's no way that this ends any worse, right? Because he's there. I don't know. What else did you guys want to talk about the scene? I think we definitely need to talk about his conversation with Tom Riddle, and like the there's worse things than death. I think that is one of the great messages of the entire series, is that like physical death is not as bad as like moral death, especially if you're still living. So, but anyway, I'll punt it back to you guys.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you have to say on that, Wes. Just I would note that just to the comic element, Neville's wand gets broken in a life or death situation, and obviously his first thought is that his grand is going to kill him. And also, that tarantula allegro, I would think it's called. Tarantula plus allegro, which is, an Italian movement of music that you can dance to. A sprightly one, apparently. Also that he so impotently attempts to stun the Death Eaters, right? He I think has Hermione's wand at that moment, and then he's trying to cast stunning spells, and literally nothing is happening. But yeah, I just wanted to note those couple features, and then pass it over to you, Wes.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think Neville really acquits himself pretty well here, all things considered. We do find out like that he and Harry are equivalent in some sense, and that Harry has been marked by Voldemort, sort of like in accord with the prophecy, but without knowing the prophecy, apparently. So that's, pretty interesting. I think the way that Dumbledore appears and Harry like sort of has this moment where he realizes that they're saved. That was really interesting to me, especially given that he is so angry at Dumbledore at the same time, right? And I wonder if it's that which goes through Tom Riddle's mind when he sees Dumbledore too, right? That he's saved. And I like that's the thing that he can't accept or something like that. Because that's what is sort of so confusing to me about the Tom Riddle and Dumbledore relationship, is that they seem to have been very much so, like the way that Harry has a double in Neville, he has maybe an even stronger double in Lord Voldemort, aka Tom Riddle. And so I think that when we see things go through Harry's mind, we can assume pretty safely that something like that is going through Voldemort's mind, right? And it's like their thoughts are very similar, their powers are very similar. What distinguishes them is their feelings or their heart, Voldemort has like actively shattered and hidden his, whereas Harry is, proved to be a good person, a human being by the way that he feels pain and suffers. And so, so it's like, it's really interesting to think about like, what's the kind of person who's terrified of being saved, right? That's like, to go to the sort of the Christological interpretation, like that's the like the absolute hardcore atheist or something, right? Like you refuse, even when you understand, even when you like think about deeply and maybe even like have moments of what you would call weakness, right? Where you want to believe or something, you just like refuse on principle. and you fight against, with all your strength, because you like have to assert that you are the more important thing. And so like, yeah, that your death is like the worst possible thing, right? That's the worst thing there is. And so to have salvation be a possibility is like out of order for Tom Riddle. So I found that scene, like their combat is cool and fun and stuff, but I found like what they say to each other is definitely very powerful there.
Yeah, very much non serviam. I will not serve, or better to rule in heaven or in hell than to serve in heaven, says the angel of then tarnished glory, Milton Satan in Paradise Lost, book 1. And, he literally becomes a snake too, just as Voldemort now looks like a snake and has a snake familiar. And very interesting, again, that connection to ugliness and the difference in beauty. But the big question I wanted to ask was about the spells that they used, both Dumbledore and Voldemort, and how those are representative of what you've just suggested, Wes. Are they in any way representative, or also you, Sarah, too, of Voldemort's tendency to disintegrate not only his own soul, but people and their the matter from their soul? He kills people, and he also tries to disintegrate communities through lies, right? He and controlling minds, and through turning people against each other and having them fight each other as if they're the enemies and turn on their own heroes, like Harry Potter, who now, I just wanted to note, he too, like Voldemort, it has his honor, his name of honor. So just as Voldemort's power is acknowledged by calling him he who must not be named, but also is evil, so is Harry called the boy who lived now again. And so he sort of has a return to glory for a moment, though it doesn't give him much happiness at the time that he receives it. But I did want to ask about we see at the very least a water spell, and then what other sorts of spells do we see in this fight, and what do you think that they mean, Sarah and Wes?
I'm going back and reviewing it at the moment. This is like pages 718, 719 for me, but could be different pages for y'all. I'm in the British version. I think one thing that's interesting is they use like the product of each other's magic and kind of turn it on one another. But I mean, just that pattern that you noted, Alex, that it seems as though when Dumbledore is saying, your failure to understand that there are things much worse than death has always been your greatest weakness. And then the centaur from the statue gallops in front of Dumbledore and takes the blast, a shot of green light for Dumbledore, which is similar, I think, to Fawkes taking one of the spells. Like there's things that there's things in the world that Dumbledore can like draw to himself to like that offer him sacrifice, right? I think we saw that already at Hogwarts, like Firenze agreeing to serve the school at great cost to himself and his community, right? And Fawkes has done this more than once, has given his current life for his master. I think if again, to apply like a Christological lens, that means Dumbledore can inspire a kind of like self-sacrificing love in people who are and creatures that he accords with value, right? That's something he talks about with Harry later, the importance of like repairing what the magical world the damage the magical world has done by like manipulating and using different magical species and creatures for their own benefit and value, and that like that's something that like a new era or a new age of magical rule and leadership is going to have to reckon with. To me, that's like a super post-colonial comment. That like, I don't know. I don't know where I'm going with that, but anyway, that's what I saw.
Yeah, I'm just reviewing that too. Yeah, go on.
I wanted to throw out, I mean, the fight that Harry has with Bellatrix briefly there, he uses one of the unforgivable curses on her, right? And he does it in such a way that it just makes her like angry, right? It doesn't really hurt her that much because he has the wrong sort of feeling behind it. And again, like that seems to be, so that's like inspired by his love of Sirius, right? Like that's the feeling that he puts behind the curse. And so it doesn't really work. The same thing I think happens. So like Voldemort's sort of final attempt here is to possess Harry. That's like the last spell he uses in the duel, is to possess Harry and tell Dumbledore to kill him using Dumbledore's own words against him, right? Death is nothing, kill the boy. And that seems to be what is going through Harry's mind. But then he thinks, I'll see Sirius again, and that seems to lift the spell. So it's like there's a weird way that the sort of the feeling behind the spell seems to be as important as like the different spells themselves, is I guess what I would say.
Yeah, it's almost like his willingness to die, his allowing himself to be sacrificed is what dispels Voldemort in that moment. But just back to the point that was made earlier about the emotion of Harry being his strength as opposed to Voldemort who hides from his emotion. That is precisely what Harry denies in front of Dumbledore, though, again, Dumbledore does not believe it in the same way that Bellatrix does not believe the Cruciatus curse that he casts, perhaps out of personal pain rather than a pleasure in other people's pain. And perhaps that's why he's been forgiven for his outbursts, because he's not trying to hurt people. It's because he's hurting, and people recognize that. And they hurt with him, like Hagrid will later on, when he comes and goes so quickly and gulps down his drink. But yeah, so that the earlier question is the one that I'm actually interested in considering, though I'm starting to forget it in sort of a Theophilus Lovegood sort of fashion.
The earlier question about the spells, is that what we?
Yeah, that's the question I'm remembering too. I mean, I found it interesting that Dumbledore has this time with Harry that he sort of finally sets out, kind of like a summary of all the books so far, but from his perspective, right? And so if we're sort of like getting to see Dumbledore's perspective, that's very like it's highly privileged information here, and it's exactly what we haven't had throughout this whole book, right? Which is part of what's made Harry so mad all along, is that he's been separated from Dumbledore. To get this all kind of given to us all at once here, I mean, I think it does work, but I found it quite, I think theatrical, the way that Dumbledore sort of constructs this discussion. He has Harry, he's almost quizzing Harry. Like, do you see what I did wrong? Do you see the flaw yet? I found that really strange that he kind of phrases it that way, and that he takes blame for it, but still tries to sort of tell Harry like some of Sirius's flaws in this moment when Harry really can't hear that just yet. So what did you guys think of the way that Dumbledore has his duel with Harry Potter in the Lost Prophecy chapter?
Well, I for sure made a connection between the review by Dumbledore with Harry to Cantos 21 and 22 of the Paradiso, where you have the literal planetary review on Saturn in the sphere of contemplation, climbing the golden ladder of information, which is, I would argue, the same analogy as the analogy of going out of the cave for Plato. the allegory of the cave, and deriving new information and then bringing it back into a place where you have to sort of fumblingly communicate it, and it upsets people because, again, that's that truth that upsets harmony, even if the harmony is based on lies. And so I made that connection because what Dante does in the sphere of contemplation is he attains a higher perspective on his journey so far. He has a moment in heaven that is like the purgatorial night where he gets to reflect on what has happened, literally from a higher perspective, on a ladder above the spheres he has covered so far, and he starts to see them in a new way, from a higher perspective, a more divine way. And that strikes me as correlate to now seeing these last several books from the perspective of Dumbledore, like you said, essentially like the perspective of somebody with a higher perspective, or like a divine perspective, like his super eagle, the Phoenix Fox. That's sort of the connection I made. Sarah, what do you see?
That's great. I'm not as familiar with the Paradiso as I am with the Inferno, but I love that idea that that contemplation is taking the view of providence.
Yes.
And right, you both know that, like, I've spent a lot of my career in Ignatian education in particular, and I know I've mentioned it multiple times in our conversations, the Ignatian concepts that I read in here. But I too got, I thought it was interesting that I think my favorite thing about this is how difficult it is for Dumbledore to own what he considers are his weaknesses, and how difficult it is for Harry to accept them, right? To me, this was, on the one hand, I again, like I said, I have a hard time not seeing some of the Christological elements. I see this as kind of like a commissioning, in order to know what you're called to do, there has to be some measure of study of where you've been, right? This to me is like a real conversion moment, and conversion doesn't happen immediately, right? It happens, at least for St. Ignatius, it happened over the course of a very long convalescence after being injured in battle. And he initially found this injury to be an interruption in his life. Like, it was going to keep him from being the courtly knight, the lover and the defender of the honor of the king that he so wanted to be in. But what he over time painfully comes to learn is that the interruption in what he thought was his life or his life's plan was actually an invitation to something that he did not know would give him satisfaction on a deeper level. So I read this passage kind of like being in the hospital wing, but the hospital wing for your soul, right? That, like, Harry is not physically injured by, at least not badly, by the scene in the ministry. Maybe that's because he was carrying the prophecy, so he didn't get like that terrible burn that Hermione gets, right? But he needs serious recovery, and the recovery maybe isn't going to be at the hands of Madame Pomfrey, but it has to be at the hands of a healer of sorts. And it's somebody maybe who can divulge information to him, answer some of his questions. But I agree that the chapter is really long, and it feels like a lot is being explained for us that we could never have known without this chapter, which I think is sometimes kind of annoying in a narrative where, like, you get to the end and you're like, and it's like when a detective in a detective novel, when they like explain all of the stuff that, like, there's no way you would have seen. And because it is privileged, it feels like you're sort of trespassing on this like therapeutic convalescence, I think. And you have, I don't know, I see a lot of like Ignatian elements in this. This is like like there's so much darkness, and there's so much facing of darkness, and every time Harry seems to calm down, it turns right back around, and he, he gets even more angry. And Dumbledore doesn't tell him not to be angry. I think that's another thing I really like, is that he doesn't ever say, like, sit down and shut up, you little brat. Like, he doesn't say, like, stop yelling at me. Like, Dumbledore takes it, and it's like therapy for him. But I think that I find it effective. Mostly, honestly, like, I think it answers a lot of unanswered questions that I had when I first read the series. Like, I think that there's so much information that's delivered to us in this way, and I truly can't imagine another way for it to be delivered. But it's almost like an invitation for Harry to, like, start a new mission, like a mission that maybe you didn't think that you were made for, but that you don't have a choice for, I guess.
Perhaps a second war. And that makes me think that the fight between Dumbledore and Voldemort is, allegorically speaking, a fight over Harry's soul. And that is why he literally gets possessed at the end. And then just to make a connection to Harry hating Albus Dumbledore's human elements when he puts his head in his hands. It's so human for suffering or tiredness, and either way it's human, and that's precisely what Voldemort seems incapable of accepting about himself, and perhaps also about Dumbledore, because it is the fact that sort of the light can shine through Dumbledore as a human that is such a critique of Voldemort's negating dark being. And he even shoots green shots out of his wand, whereas Dumbledore shoots red, and sort of a Star Wars-like thing going there. But also he tries to use killing curses, whereas Dumbledore, Voldemort even comments, are you beyond that? But it makes me think that perhaps this fight is a fight between good and evil in the soul of Harry after this new terrible thing has happened to him, after this awful year, that there's just so much that's happened that he wants to deny his own humanity. And, that is what he actually does in front of Dumbledore. That makes me recall my question from earlier, that just as we had said, his emotions are his strength. He says, then I don't want to be a human if I have to deal with this, just to agree also with you, Sarah, in the sort of presence of that suicide and negating element, and also that necessity for truth to convert him, to bring him to a higher perspective, so that this battle for his soul can be put to an end. Because it is as if it is finally boiling all over. And I do like that element of the headmasters of old being so disapproving of Harry's tone. They recognize that it is only because of the personal relationship between Dumbledore and Harry that this is allowed. Absolutely not if he's a student. I mean, they certainly see this as a breach in his conduct. But like you also mentioned, Sarah, like Voldemort is very placid here, and I think he really shows his symbolic nature. As he has half moon glasses. He is, of course, silver. He is helping Harry reflect. He's very much like the moon here in its capacity as Dante's moon on the Purgatorio, as reflecting in order to bring somebody to a higher perspective as the way to battle the evil in someone's soul. I guess that's really what my question is. If you can interpret this in any way allegorically, what is the weapon that Dumbledore uses contra Voldemort to win this battle for Harry, or to bring him back to the good side, so that he, even though he has these same feelings as Voldemort, even rage at Dumbledore in the same way that he had that rage earlier, but it had been Voldemort's. How is it that he brings him back to the boy who makes the choices that Voldemort did not?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of what I'm seeing here, just like in terms of the storytelling process, so Dumbledore apologizes for not having told Harry sooner, right? And that has a lot of sort of objects. The thing that he didn't tell him sooner was that he is the subject of a prophecy. The thing that he didn't tell Harry sooner was that one of the two of them has to die, right? He didn't tell him sooner that he is like Neville in some ways. So there's like a lot of aspects of that, but I think another part of what he didn't tell him soon enough was that he has that close relationship with him, and that has consequences, right? That's sort of like the thing that kept him from telling him all this stuff, was because he cared about him too much, right? He admires him, he sort of loves him, and that's where he was especially, I think, like surprised at himself a little bit there, is that he acted exactly as Voldemort expects we fools who love to act, right? So like he was weak in some way because of his love, and that's so interesting that he has to sort of admit that to Harry here, and sort of like argue or kind of present his case at least for why he did what he did. He apparently placed the charm on Harry, which sort of combined with his mother's sacrifice. So in a way, he's also responsible for keeping Harry alive at this point, by having him, safe at the Dursleys' house these 15 years or whatever. So that comes out here as well. And so,
yeah,
like the quality of his love is essentially, protective, but also has kept all this knowledge from him. That's interesting to me, because that's what, again, like what's not happening in this chapter is that we're not having anything kept from us. We're having everything told to us. That's what makes the story work. The rest of the time is that we don't know what's going to happen next. We want to find out, and so it's a weird way in which, like, I think the storyteller is saying, like, I really care about you. I want you to like learn something from this story, or like see something important as a learning process. And so I had to do it this way. Like, forgive me for this chapter. I don't know that.
No, I agree. No, go for it. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, I was just gonna say, I think we'll see this again at the end of whenever it is that that Dumbledore drinks the cup to its dregs. It's sort of the same thing going on again there.
Like the exposure of himself as weak, you mean? Like the humbling of himself? Is that what you think is the pattern, or the
basically.
storytelling technique? Yeah.
Well,
I think I was just gonna say, like, at the end of the 7th book, I know we'll see like a little bit more expository explanation of what happened, right? But I think you're right, Wes, to point out that, like, unlike previous storytelling experiences throughout this story, like, everything is kind of being backwards explained for us from a different perspective, like to show us, maybe to like point us to a couple key themes or ideas, and it's a little bit moralizing, but like it's such a divergence from the way that the story has worked, like us being just as in the dark about things as the kids are, that it seems like we're being ushered into, or like baptized into, a new sense of gravity, right? Like given new knowledge, but not given new knowledge and nothing to do with it, right? Like like Harry and the reader are being invited into a deeper, if they're being given this global view, if they're being given this kind of the view of providence, like as you said, Alex, from like the raised ladder, well, like a contemplative doesn't stay there, right? I mean, well, maybe some contemplatives do, but you don't, I mean, like with this knowledge, you don't get to just like rest on your laurels, right? I think part of the thing that I didn't like about this chapter is that he starts with, here's why I didn't tell you this, books 1, 2, 3, and 4, mostly because, like, every single reason he gave for not telling them is totally valid, so not in need of an apology, but B, like, you're telling now, so don't apologize for not doing it earlier. I don't know, but developmentally, like, what he's asking of Harry is not appropriate before this moment, right? Not in any way. I mean, not really appropriate for a 16-year-old anyway, but like to be given special knowledge, like special insight and special care, right? To like like you mentioned, the combination of the, Dumbledore's charm and his mother's sacrifice. Damn, if that isn't just a little bit like, Mary and God or whatever. But I think the thing that Dumbledore does when he lowers himself or humbles himself or weakens himself is he invites people into that as well. And so like, it's sort of hokey, but like when you allow yourself to be vulnerable or broken and exposed, it invites other people to do the same, rather than to try and present himself as powerful and in control and like above everybody else. There's no way to build a team that way. There's no way to build a community that way. There's no way to build like an effective partnership that way. And I think the other thing that he does that Voldemort doesn't, like to your question earlier, Alex, about the weapon that he wields with Harry, is that along with the knowledge comes freedom, but not freedom to avoid things or to be free from things, but freedom to choose a certain kind of path, like to choose to be the thing that you were made for. You can only make that choice fully if you are fully informed, I guess. And up to that point, anything Harry was doing was something that Dumbledore had gone out of his way to kind of orchestrate, right? And to set up so that Harry would and could find success. Whereas I think what he realized, I think one of the things that made me sad the most, or actually kind of teared up at this point, was when he said that it's easy when you're old to forget what it's like to be young, and that I've made the mistakes of an old man, right? That like maybe he himself is feeling his mortality, and that like he needs to put Harry in a position to freely choose without his guidance the right path. And like that gift is what I think is the only weapon that he has at his disposal, because anything else wouldn't be a full choice. I don't know if that really makes any sense.
I completely agree, and just have some different words to say the exact same thing. And also Dante would totally agree with your idea on the fact that humans have a contingent will that is based, that, they can choose to parallel with the absolute will of God in order to live out their fate. And that's the so-called good life for Dante. And that one doesn't have the freedom to do or to redefine one's morality, but one does have the freedom of whether to live up to one's destiny or not. And it's so interesting, Wes, that you're sort of making these connections to sort of life as a mystery that can't be unlocked, in the same way that the tree of life is a tree from which we cannot eat. And then in even potentially older story, the Gilgamesh story, the tree or the plant of life is that which is denied to Gilgamesh. So again, that is the ultimate mystery that we just can't unlock. But also you seem to be mentioning the tree of knowledge here as well, and talking about that which Dumbledore reveals, but also how it is knowledge. And Sarah, you were saying this too, that sort of unlocks the boundaries in which you have found yourself, and then you go out and are free to explore somewhere new, but you are not free to return to the world that you once lived in. Cherubim now sort of guard that. Time has entered in. You're in the desert now. You have to seek out your new Troy, your new Ithaca, your new Jerusalem. But just another biblical connection, just another Old Testament one that I see here, also a Buddhist one based on that story of the Buddha I told you all about, his father keeping him in a walled garden, a paradiso, is I see also Dumbledore doing that, or having done that to Harry, and sort of asking to be forgiven for the noble lie, so-called, that Harry was too young, so he was kept in the Dursleys, a walled garden, a place where he can be safe. And then in Hogwarts, another walled garden, a place that keeps him safe, but not fully informed. And so now it's time to inform him of just how vulnerable he really is, and of just how much Dumbledore has helped him. He has to break down those walls now in order to expand Harry's perspective, but that's going to cause Harry, of course, tremendous pain, but also give him the opportunity through going through that pain to show his human sort of dignity, his human worth, because it's in expanding his perspective that he will attain the clarity of thought necessary to continue progressing forward on the path of good. But I also wanted to mention on that, and I think that connects back to the theme of truth disrupting harmony and having to restore a new harmony after that, but then again, always searching for a new Ithaca, new unexplored territory. But that also the wall metaphor also ties to J.K. Rowling, what she's doing as a storyteller here. You made me think of this, Wes, where she has invited us into this walled garden, right? This place where we cannot be hurt in this literature, though what we actually literally read here, that thoughts can hurt you. And so she breaks her own wall in order to ingest, to give us some serious emotion and some serious consideration about death here. Like, this is a taking off of the third wall and an invitation of us into the pain of this world, or a paralleling of the pain of losing in Harry. If we've just been riding along, sharing in his highs, it's time to pay the piper and feel the lows and lows with him too, if we're going to identify with him. I feel like this is how she really starts to fill him as a character. And like you both were suggesting, how she starts to sort of instigate character growth in us as well, through making us confront again death, and the fact that it keeps happening and that it is not easier to deal with this time. And especially in the wake of that comic element that you've been mentioning, Wes, all the more unexpected. And that's so funny because I just started teaching Oedipus, and I'm talking about the difference between comedy. Well, I teach the Divine Comedy, and I'm still teaching that. I should be finished soon, but also teaching this tragedy with the Oedipus. And those are like the two ways of looking at life. Like you were saying earlier, you're like putzing around thinking nothing matters, and then bam, something happens that makes you realize everything matters. It's like those walls come crumbling down in that moment, and then you, like a spider, have to sort of, I don't know if make them stronger, but certainly expand them and alter what it all looks like seems necessary. And that I also see as a connection to what you made as a point last time, Sarah, about how the first 4 years or first 5 years of Hogwarts could be like high school, and the last 2 years like college. After the OWLs, it's like, yes, everything is far more serious now.
Yeah, I like that point a lot. I mean, in the way that Dumbledore's talking, second person, it's hard not to hear his words as being in some way directed at the reader too, right? You were too young. I can tell you everything, but now I can tell you everything, and you have to understand why I didn't make you a prefect. So,
and we were denied that.
Yeah. Well, that same phrase, I found this kind of strange too. Like, Madame Pomfrey uses almost the exact same words. It's some kind of expression like you had enough to be going on with, right? She uses that 2 pages later in the chapter where we hear how she sort of fixed everybody back up again. And I thought that was kind of a curious echo. I don't know how intentional that was on Rowling's part, but I'm inclined to think it was probably, pretty purposeful. Like you're saying, right? Like, they go through a physical healing. Harry goes through a kind of mental and emotional, or at least initiates the healing process for him. And I guess, that's kind of what we're all engaged in, I guess, as readers too.
Yeah. I think one thing that I really liked in the last chapter, Harry's healing isn't over, right? He has this conversation with Dumbledore, and by the end there's a lot of quiet. It doesn't really seem like there's a lot of forgiveness. There doesn't really seem like a lot of any peace or harmony is truly achieved, really, but that scene where he and Luna kind of bond a little bit about what they've experienced in terms of grief, And she so awkwardly is like, oh yeah, Ginny told me he was your godfather, right? Like, I'm sorry, you know, that's something that we've seen all year for Harry is that he cannot figure out how to, in a healthy way, allow people to be with him while he's broken. And for a while, it was about Cedric, and it was about his own role in the rise of Voldemort again, and it was his impotence at saving someone who, in many ways, was on paper better than him. His confusion as to why he survived and why nobody believes him, blah, blah, blah. But like every time people tried to understand, he kind of barked at them, right? He just couldn't figure out how to be vulnerable. And I don't know. I'm not saying that Dumbledore being vulnerable with him in one chapter makes him more vulnerable with another character in another, but I do think that is like leaning into our weaknesses as a way of like building healthy, effective community, especially in contrast to the Death Eaters, where what they harp on is their strength, and they do not brook weakness, and weakness is to be punished, and there's like dominion and power. And you know, when Bellatrix fails, she like throws herself at the feet of Voldemort at the Ministry, whereas I don't know, the Order of the Phoenix and Dumbledore's leadership thereof, and it really seems to present like a different look of a community or a different team setup. And that conversation that he has with Luna is like this time where he doesn't really need to fake who he is. He doesn't need to run away. Even he runs away from Hagrid, so Hagrid doesn't see him cry. He doesn't want to be around Ron and Hermione, right? But like he's cool being around Luna and acknowledging that, like, yeah, that was my godfather. And do you sometimes think about your mom? And it's like he's just now taking these baby steps to bond with other people in like shared suffering, right? And you know, I think like being able to name your own suffering allows you to better see it in other people and maybe be a little more empathetic. Just, you know, like trauma that goes underaddressed or unaddressed at all is so often the root cause of future trauma. You know, long story short, everybody should be in therapy. But that conversation, that long chapter with Dumbledore, really, on the other end of it, it really seems like spiritual direction / therapy. That's what I think it is. / remedial lesson.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm forgetting my exact point that I wanted to say in reference to that, but I do completely agree that it is like a therapy, because if you know the author is going to wound us, then it's best if we're given an attempt at an antidote. But yes, that's what I was going to say, is that it's interesting also in the comment that when you suffer, it produces the opportunity for new relationships and new connections to people, because of course something that Harry shares with Luna is that they have both lost people close to them, and so they can speak very frankly about that, and so that draws him to her and also allows him and I think it's so interesting, Hermione just showing that she knows Harry as well as Voldemort does, that he has a hero thing, and that's exactly what Lucius Malfoy says lured him down into the Department of Mysteries. He has a great weakness for heroics, Malfoy says, and we didn't get to talk about him too much, unfortunately, or maybe it's best just leave him unnamed. But it seems interesting that Harry is also given a chance for heroics with Luna here, like a small one, like, why are people messing with you? And I also thought that was sad, even though I was already very sad because of Sirius's death, sad in a different way, sort of a pitiful way, the same way that Harry, or the narrator describes it, that Harry's feeling of pity intensifies when he hears that Luna gets messed with not only just this time but all the time, and how that was that part of him overcoming the grief process, and that he is speaking frankly, and that he's focusing on different things, or what's happening there exactly. And then I suppose we have to close because it's getting pretty late here.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, everything that's lost is going to turn up like it always does. She's got a kind of optimistic note for the end of the book there, and they also give the Dursleys a stern talking to, so that bodes well for Harry's summer, right?
Yes. Every 3 days. So now he can be in communication again, like the point you made there, Sarah, that bringing people together is Voldemort's weakness. Is Voldemort's weakness is Albus Dumbledore's gift and power, and just connect that to the name of the book, The Order of the Phoenix, and New Beginning, and even Fox, who literally gets does he get skinned, and then he's just pretty stubby and gross looking, and then he returns to the headmaster's office when Albus Dumbledore returns to all of his offices, including Arch Warlock or highest Warlock in the Wisengamot. But it's as if the true order or proper order is being restored in this book, finally. I'm really looking forward to the Half-Blood Prince with you two. It's so funny. Sarah, I was just reading an article that Wes wrote that was a transcription of a talk we had over the summer, early summer. And in that talk, we were talking about trying to convince you to do this project. And now look how far we've come. Speaking of time.
No way. Wes, where's this article?
It's I can send you the link. It's on a video game journalism webpage. Yeah.
I think did you post about this? I think
I think I
saw
put
it
on Facebook. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, it's really cool to see an idea go from conception to reality in this way. And so perhaps Dumbledore is bringing all of us together as well. I'm looking forward to another interesting book with our favorite half-blood, Harry, and this soon to be named, or perhaps late to be named, Parallel, if it is not Harry himself.
Dun, dun, dun.
Heyo.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Until next time, y'all.
All right.
Salud.
All right.
Cheers.
Cheers, y'all. Sleep well. Take it easy.
Take care.
You too. Bye.